Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 67, A Good Person's Ire. Yang had always taken pride in people looking in her direction. Her shining mane of blonde hair, her outfits that were designed to show off just enough skin to make people want more, her cheerful and easygoing personality, all of them had been purposely curated over the years as a way to unwind from taking care of RWBY and getting some attention on herself. It had always felt amazing to be the center of attention, to have people watch her dancing in the center of the club and flirting with those who occasionally came over to dance with her. However, even she was getting annoyed by the constant glances her classmates were sending her team's way while trying to eat their breakfast. Unlike the glances at the club, which always tended to be hungry or admiring, the glances that had been sent their way over the past week and a half had been judgmental and full of contempt, both of which had grown as more and more of Blake's past began to spread around the school. At first, it had merely been that she was a fauness and the daughter of Menagerie's chieftain, but under the misguided belief it was their business, some students had gone back and tried to uncover more. Unfortunately, that had been successful, and the past few days had seen the hushed whispers turn from her status as royalty to her time in the White Fang. Of course, people had not taken the news well. Pretty much everywhere they went they were met with snide looks. People had begun to move out of their way while muttering something about terrorists. Some had cancelled study and sparring sessions, and even a few of the faunus that had been a lot kinder to Blake were starting to distance themselves from her. To say they were becoming the school's pariah team would not have been a stretch, but as much as she missed the admiring looks of her classmates, the thing Yang hated the most was the effect it was having on her partner. While the girl had not explicitly said anything, the movement of her ears under her ribbon was all Yang needed to know that Blake wasn't happy about it. Whenever they left their room, they would quickly lie flat against her head and only begin to perk up again when there was nobody around. Unfortunately though, while Yang was more than happy to put them in their place, Blake had been very quick to chastise her after she had slammed a boy into a locker due to a particularly vile comment. Despite her personal belief that some cunt simply deserved to be punched, Blake seemed to be taking a more peaceful, non-violent approach, and she was going to respect that. For the time being, at least. "You know, I think I preferred it when people spent the day staring at my tits," she said loudly, sticking her finger up at a team of second years only for Blake to quickly slap it away. "If it makes you feel any better, I'm still staring at them." Coco smirked with a quick glance down, causing Weiss to groan from behind her tablet. "It always does," she admitted, loving how open her girlfriend was about it. "But they're still pissing me off." "Just ignore them," Blake sighed. "I speak from experience when I say that being hostile towards them does nothing but make it worse." "So what? I'm just supposed to sit here and let them keep bad-mouthing you." "I'm not doing nothing," Blake countered. "I'm reporting them to Glinda." "Blake is right, Yang," Velvet added. "Attacking them just confirms what they're saying about us." "Yeah, well," Yang groaned and stabbed a piece of kiwi with her fork, knowing they were right. "They're still assholes. That I won't deny." With a hum, Blake turned back to RWBY and continued what she was saying about some old war that had taken place in Mistral years ago. Unfortunately, before she could even get more than 2 words out, they heard a derisive snicker from behind them. Turning around, they were all met with the sneering face of Cardin Winchester. "Angry that people are upset about having a terrorist in their class?" the boy said with a smug grin. "Fuck off, Cardin," Coco growled, though the boy took no notice. "You know, I thought you were better than this, Rose." Yang felt her blood boil as he addressed her sister, but before she could do anything, she saw RWBY give the bully an uncharacteristically mean scowl. "What does that mean?" the Reaper asked. "Well, I know you've got this whole let's be friends thing. I'll do anything to make someone happy, but that's one pussy even I wouldn't eat." Cardin's words were clearly chosen purposely to trigger a reaction, and a reaction was definitely what he got. As the boy gave an amused chuckle and took a step back, both Yang and Coco lifted from their seat to confront the boy. However, much to Yang's surprise, so had RWBY, her hand held out to stop them as she glared at the boy herself. "You know what, Cardin?" she fired back angrily. "I do like people being friends, and I've even defended you from people, but I'm done. Blake may have made mistakes, but at least she regrets hurting people and deserves to be here. That's more than can be said for you." And since you obviously don't care about being friends, or actually being a decent human being, I'm not gonna to bother stepping in the next time Cobalt or someone beats you up because you've done something to deserve it. Yang was too taken aback to be angry. Never in all 16 years of knowing the girl had she heard Ruby talk to someone in such a way. Even Weiss, with whom she occasionally quarreled, had never been spoken to in such a way. Apparently, she wasn't the only one fed up with how Blake was being treated, and as she looked at Cardin's stunned face, Yang couldn't help but feel a little bit of pride. Is there a problem here? Glinda's stern voice said, the woman appearing behind the boy with her arms folded. Cardin is being racist, Professor, Ruby replied quickly. The older woman scowled and glanced around the table and received a nod from everyone there. I see the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Very well, Mr. Winchester, you will follow me. Miss Adele, put your weapon away. And Miss Xiaolong, your hair is on fire. Looking up, Yang saw that semblance-born flames were indeed dancing along the length of her golden locks, so gave her head a quick shake to extinguish them. Big mistake, Dash. He was cut off as an invisible force yanked him forward. Green eyes flashed back from the older huntress, and even Cardin wasn't stupid enough to ignore that warning. With one last glare in their direction, he took off after the woman. A collective sigh ran through the group, and all three girls sat back down in their seats. Cut! Coco scowled, Velvet quickly poking her. Nice tongue lashing though, Red. Didn't know you had it in you. Yeah, well, I'm tired of people treating Blake like the bad guy. The girl sighed, sitting back down and taking her girlfriend's hand. It's not right. It's fine, Ruby. Blake smiled at her softly. You did the right thing. The right thing would have been to punch him through the wall. Hence why I am glad Ruby handled it and not you. Yang received a glare from her partner. What did I tell you about violence? Yes, violence bad, talking good. Yang grumbled and returned to her food. None of you were complaining yesterday when Weiss made a girl cry. She caught me in a bad mood. The heiress shrugged unapologetically. Weiss didn't throw a punch, Velvet added, though Yang noted a tone of disapproval in her voice. We know you just want to help, Yang, and we really do love you for it, but you need to keep a cool head when dealing with this. And your head runs more on the hotter side. Coco hummed. In many ways, she added with a wink. Didn't you stand up with me? No comment. Shaking her head at the smirk that overcame her girlfriend's face, Yang let out a small huff and leant her head against her cheek. She hated feeling like there was nothing she could do to help her friend, but she knew they were right. As cathartic as it was, punching someone wasn't going to change their mind. Anyway, Blake yawned. I think I'm going to head down to Vale. My parents should be waking up soon. All right. Ruby smiled at her. I'll see you back in the dorm later. MHM. Yang watched as the two shared a brief kiss. She loved how close they were becoming, but there was also a little fear for just how quickly Ruby was growing up. It was less than a year ago that the girl would cling to her pillow and babble innocently about nothing but weapons. You want to come with me, Velvet? Blake asked, throwing her bag over her shoulder. You can talk to them about your school. Are you sure that's okay? Blake gave the girl a nod. It would be good to run it by the chief. I'd love to join. Have fun, Bun. Coco smiled and leaned in to give her a kiss. You go realize your dream. What Coco said. Yang nodded, happily accepting a kiss from the fauness. Let us know how it goes. Giving her a smile, Yang watched her girlfriend and her best friend make their way towards the exit. It was yet another thing that she couldn't help but feel sad about. As proud as she was that Velvet was going for her dream, just like with Ruby, there was still a little part of her that was scared. Though both Coco and Velvet still did plenty to reassure her that nothing was going to change, Yang was having to accept that there was always going to be a part of her that worried about people leaving. And that was something she had to work on herself. Feeling Coco take her hand and flash her a charming smile though, Yang was quick to return it, feeling butterflies erupt in her stomach far stronger than anything the stares she had received while on the dance floor. If that feeling was what learning to conquer her fears was for, then there was definitely no doubt about whether it was worthwhile or not. More than ever, Blake was becoming extremely appreciative of the time spent inside her dorm room. While she had certainly not expected the school to take the news of her past affiliations well, The amount of conversation it had sparked had surprised even her. It seemed to be all people were talking about. Everywhere she went, she constantly felt like she was being judged, and her enhanced hearing always managed to find a conversation about her, even when she wasn't even in the same room as the people discussing it. Sadly, that meant that the places in the school she had previously enjoyed were no longer viable places to relax. Even the library, where she loved to curl up in a small, hidden corner with a good book, felt noisy and uncomfortable. Thankfully though, with their dorm room being on the top floor, and their only real neighbor being Team J and PR, the four walls of her dormitory had become her safe haven. It wasn't that bad though. As much as she loved the library, spending the afternoon relaxing on her bed while drawing on her girlfriend's arm was definitely a more enjoyable way to spend her time. Ruby seemed to agree too. Resting against the wall next to her, using her free hand to eat cookies with a comic laid against her knees, the girl looked more relaxed than she had done all week as Blake carefully dragged a marker over her skin. "So they liked the idea?" Young asked from the couch, grinning as she watched Y's tiny Borbatusk roll excitedly around the room. "MHM," Blake hummed. "Dad said it might even put a smile on Saber's face for once." "So Velvet can open a school as soon as she finishes school?" "Not quite. She would still need to make a case in front of the family's elders first," Blake explained, "who are not exactly keen or huntsmen and huntresses in general." "What do they have against us?" Weiss asked from her desk, her Queen Lancer curled around her chair watching the board carefully. "Their parents spent their lives fighting us. Faunus weren't always allowed to attend the Huntsman Academies, remember? So when the Faunus War started, most of the practicing huntsmen sided against us. Those old war wounds run deep in Menagerie." "But Velvet's nothing like that," Ruby commented with a sigh. "I wish people would stop judging people they don't know. It's stupid." Glancing up at her girlfriend, Blake remembered how the girl had snapped at Cardin during breakfast. Seeing the girl stand up for her in such a way had made her incredibly happy at the time, but as the day had gone on, it had always made her a little worried. Ever since the mission, she'd been seeing Ruby's hopeful nature slip bit by bit as she struggled to come to terms with the fact that she couldn't save everyone, and she was starting to worry that the concerns Yang had expressed months ago about the girl losing that spark weren't entirely unfounded. Looking across at her partner, she saw the blonde also had a look of concern on her face. "The elders are cautious," Blake said, giving her girlfriend a smile. "But they'd never let that get in the way of something that could help our people protect themselves better. I'm sure Velvet can easily convince them." It wasn't a complete lie. While she was sure Velvet would be able to convince them, she knew that it would definitely take more than a few meetings. However, not wanting Ruby to have another reason to lose hope, it was a small lie that Blake could live with telling. "I hope so," Ruby nodded, returning to her comic. "So," Blake smiled at her, "want anything else added? Got enough room for one more thing." The girl lifted up her arm and inspected the outline of the sleeve Blake had drawn on her forearm of all the things the girl loved the most. "Spy." "Ugh," Blake groaned playfully, taking the arm back. "Fian. You know, I'm still not sure how I feel about you giving my little sis a tattoo." "It's not a tattoo. It'll last a week at most," Blake replied, starting on a picture of Zvi trying to squeeze himself into a tiny tube. "And she wanted it." "It feels nice." The girl grinned after looking at it. "You should try it." "I'm good, thanks," Yang scoffed, leaning over to grab 2 books from the shelf. "I don't want to take part in whatever weird thing you two have going on there." Giving a quick swish of her arm, Blake activated her semblance and let her shadow stick its middle finger up at the woman, hearing the blonde let out a chuckle in return. "Mudball," Yang called, leaning over to create a ramp out of the 2 books. "Will you stop encouraging her?" Weiss growled as the tiny ball of energy did a U-turn and zoomed up the ramp, bouncing off the wall and continuing its circling of the room. "Aw, come on, Weiss," Ruby cooed. "She's cute." "She's a pain." The heiress scowled, her lancer's mandibles chattering angrily as the Borbatusk got a little too close. "Of all my summons, she's the only one that acts like that." "Have you talked to Winter about it yet?" Blake asked. "She has no idea what I'm talking about." Weiss sighed in disappointment. "She says hers act nothing like this." That didn't exactly surprise Blake. Though she had only met Weiss' older sister once, the woman didn't exactly seem to be very in touch with her feelings. Anything that wasn't Weiss was treated with a cold, disapproving glare and a no-nonsense attitude. If her summons were to ever act in such a way, Blake was sure the woman would put an end to it immediately. "So your semblance is different?" Jan questioned. "No, it's just acting differently, which is weird since I got my Beowulf from her summons." "Makes sense to me," Ruby hummed, earning a few raised eyebrows. "I mean, your summons are you, and Winters are her." "Well, she is an updash." Weiss' eyes hardened on Yang. "Upstanding soldier," the blonde finished with a weak smile. "Yes." Weiss scowled at the blonde and turned back to her desk. "Well, at least she doesn't have to get used to the taste of Grimm." "What does it actually taste like?" Blake asked. "I don't know," the woman shrugged. "Like fire and ash and decay. It's not nice. So we'll just make sure to keep some vanilla SW." Yang was cut off as a loud, distressed squeal filled the room, causing Blake to start and almost mess up Zvi's tail. Looking up from her artwork, she saw that Mudball had finally pushed her luck too far and strayed a little too close to Weiss' lancer and ended up in its mandibles. Buzzing angrily as the little piglet tried to wriggle free, the giant hornet whipped its head to the side and flung the summon across the room and out of the window. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the slowly fading squeals as the Borbatusk fell out of sight, but the second it was gone, the sound was filled with the beautiful sound of Ruby's laughter. Having not heard it since returning from the mission, Blake felt her spirits soar and a wide grin pull at her face. "Did you tell her to do that?" Yang chuckled, pushing herself up from the couch and walking over to the window. "No, but I don't blame her," Weiss replied, leaning down to stroke the summon's thorax and receiving a light buzzing of its wings in return. "Good girl, Scotty. It is a little like living with Nora when she's summoned," Blake admitted, returning to her work on Ruby's arm. "I'm gonna tell Ren you said that." Yang grinned, sticking her head out the window. "Hey, chuck her back up, will ya? Ren will probably agree with me." Putting the finishing touches on the drawn dog, Blake reached over for her colors. "You're probably right," Yang hummed, catching the boar and pulling it back inside. "Poor little thing," she cooed, putting it under her arm. "Want some vanilla sweets?" A soft sigh escaped the heiress at Yang's newest method of torture, but she didn't object as Yang dropped down on Weiss' bed and pulled out a bag of sweets. Holding one out, she let Mudball give it a quick lick before placing it in her own mouth and pushing him toward the edge of the bed. Each time the boar rolled back, she held up a hand and waited for it to sit before holding out another treat for it to lick. "That's how I train Zvi," Ruby whispered, happily watching her sister play with the animal. Getting an idea, Blake took up her outline pen again and added a few treats, spilling out of the other end of the tube that Zvi was sticking his head into. "There, how's that?" "Perfect." This girl grinned. "Good." Blake smiled. Happy to see her girlfriend smiling so genuinely again, Blake leaned over and pressed a soft kiss against her lips. Feeling Ruby respond, she let it linger for a few seconds longer than necessary, but quickly pulled away and returned to the artwork, the happy smile lingering on both of their faces. Stifling a small yawn as she turned the page of Blake's diary, Ruby saw a little further down to her bed. Why had not been wrong when she had said that the font of his diary was not enjoyable to read. Though the very first entry had been more than enough to show that Blake was already angry when she started them, every turn of the page only seemed to make it worse. With every entry she could feel that anger twisting into something more malicious. And while there was no doubt that some of it was coming from Blake herself, Ruby couldn't help but notice a pattern. Adam. For almost every single entry of the first and second diary, the man was mentioned in at least one way or another, and it was becoming increasingly clear that he was exerting his beliefs onto her. The few times where he had not been as present in the entries, Blake had actually seemed to lighten up a little and turn more towards writing about fun little adventures with Ilya or just the average goings-on in the camp. However, whenever he returned, the entries very quickly returned to detailing the horrors that Faunus were being subjected to, and how it was their mission to free them. Thankfully, while he had been rather prevalent in the first two diaries, his presence had become a lot less by the third. According to the entries, he had been given more responsibilities that kept him much busier. As such, the third had been a more pleasant read, though not by much. "So where are you?" she heard her partner say quietly, twisting her head to see the heiress walking up a stair of glyphs to her bed. February 2012, Ruby replied, shifting aside so that the woman could sit next to her. A good month, for the most part. Considering everything else, that's not exactly hard. I suppose, Weiss hummed. Is it changing how you think of her? Of course not, Ruby replied instantly, looking over to the other side of the room, where her sister and her girlfriend were asleep. That's good, the woman hummed, giving her hand a wave to summon her Beowulf, and running her hand along its back as it curled up in her lap. So what do you make of them so far? I think Adam was making her worse, Ruby mumbled. There's still a lot of her, but he brought out the worst in her. Weiss nodded. He reminds me a lot of my father, always trying his best to make people see the world through his lens. I'm just happy she got away from him, Ruby admitted with a sigh. Maybe you should get away from your dad too. Believe me when I say that I am trying, Weiss said in a wistful tone. Unfortunately, my father is a lot more powerful than Adam, and with far more resources, so I doubt I will ever be rid of him. I guess. There were very few people in the world that Ruby genuinely disliked, but Weiss' dad was definitely one of them. Is he still blocking your cards? And my access to the company, Weiss confirmed with an uninterested nod. But I still have my inheritance, and I've quite enjoyed building this dust guide, so it doesn't bother me as much as I thought it would. So you're not going to call him back? Eventually I will have to, otherwise he will show up here. The heiress sighed and pulled out her scroll. But until that time, no. Good, she muttered and continued to read about Blake's past. So what are you doing with the guide anyway? I'm not sure yet, Weiss answered. The SDC has hoarded dust practices and knowledge and locked it behind a ludicrous paywall for years, so I'm thinking distributing my own, a lot of which was learned from the company, for free would be a good way to annoy him. She paused for a second. And help people, of course. Ruby couldn't help but chuckle a little. It was always weird seeing the lengths Weiss went to in order to annoy her father, especially considering how much respect she showed to her teachers, and how much pride she seemed to have in her family. Not that she blamed her, of course. Given how controlling he was, and how much the woman had changed since their first meeting, Ruby was happy to watch her friend continue to defy the man in any way she could, especially if doing so also helped others. That would be really helpful to a lot of people, Ruby hummed with a smile. So it's just you working on it still? Nobody else. Velvet is helping with the coding side, Weiss said with a shrug. But it's just you with the dust? Weiss caught the curiosity in her tone and raised a suspicious eyebrow. Nobody else dash. I have enough of your sister doing that, Weiss scowled. Sorry, Ruby apologized quickly. But you did say we could talk about cute boys. You don't find boys cute. And you are fully aware that I was being sarcastic when I said that. But you still said it, Ruby said and stuck out her tongue. Come on, Weiss. I'm your friend and partner. If you can't talk to me about it, who else can you talk to? Weiss continued to give her an unamused glare. Ruby knew that talking about her feelings was not exactly Weiss' favorite thing ever, so didn't dare push her too far like her sister did. However, as the second passed and Ruby gave her nothing but a smile in return, the scowl slowly softened and the white-haired woman shook her head. Fine, the woman said with a reluctant breath. What do you want to know? Yes. She cheered at the rare opportunity, dropping the diary and turning to face her partner. So do you like him? Maybe. Weiss groaned and leaned back against bed. He's infuriating, and his ego is enough to rival your sister's, but I suppose I do enjoy his company. We mostly argue, but it's nice, and it doesn't feel like I have to hold anything back like I do everyone else. That's weird, Ruby chuckled, Weiss rolling her eyes in response. But if you can be yourself around him, and you enjoy his company, then that's great. That's something I love about being with Blake. But I didn't want a serious relationship while I was here. Weiss, you've met someone you have a bunch in common with, and actually enjoy being around because you can be yourself. Do you really want to ignore that because of something you decided last year before even experiencing it? Ruby paused and let out a low breath. Besides, we're huntresses. We kinda have to take advantage of those things when we can. I suppose that's true, Weiss admitted thoughtfully. Though do I really want to add a fourth annoyance to my life? Seeing a smirk pull at Weiss's lips, Ruby bumped her with her shoulder and let out a hushed laugh. As much as Weiss complained, Ruby knew that the woman did in fact value each of them. Even Yang, though that one probably depended on the day. Shush, you love us. You certainly put that love to the test sometimes. Weiss grinned. That's just what being sisters is like. Ruby smiled and reached out to scratch behind Allie's ears, the small Beowulf nuzzling into her hand. You'll get used to it eventually. That is an even scarier thought than Flint's reaction to me agreeing to his date. Ruby chuckled and leaned against Weiss's shoulder. So you are going to accept? Maybe, Weiss hummed. I will sleep on it. Good. Ruby hummed, happy that she could finally offer Weiss some advice. We really should both get some sleep though. We have triple combat tomorrow, and Prince's funeral is the day after. You're right. Weiss breathed. Are you still okay with going? MHM. Ruby nodded. I think it'll be good to say goodbye, and I want to see Petaley. All right, the woman said with a smile, letting her summon fade and slipping off the bed. Good night. Hey, you're a poet and yo dash. I hate you. Laughing to herself as Weiss ducked out of sight, Ruby balanced the diary she'd been reading on the curtain rail and laid back in her bed. Though she would have much rather joined Blake in hers, the woman was a light sleeper and Ruby didn't want to wake her. She'd already done that enough over the last week and wanted to try and avoid it where she could. So, pulling her covers up over herself and giving a small yawn, she closed her eyes and let herself drift off to sleep, hoping that it would be a night without the unusual nightmare. Chapter 68. Closure. Pulling a black shawl over her shoulders, Blake let out a long yawn and sat down on the edge of her bed. Despite it not even being noon, the day had already been a long one. Before light had even begun to spill through the curtains, she'd been woken by Ruby giving up on sleep and choosing to work instead. She didn't blame the girl, of course, understanding what it was like to go to the funeral of a friend, but she really did wish the girl would get some real sleep. Even as she stood on the other side of the room fastening her corset, Blake could tell from how frequently she was having to restart that the lack of sleep was starting to wear on her. Are you doing okay? She asked, breaking the silence that had filled the room for the past 10 minutes. MHM. The Reaper hummed with a nod. Stupid lace just won't behave. Here. Yang muttered softly and moved over to her. Let me help. Thanks. Dressed in a dark brown jacket and pants that only made her hair stand out even more, the woman quickly went about tying the lace with practiced ease. You don't have to go, you know. I do, the girl said with a shake of her head. I want to go, I just don't know how I'm gonna face her. She looked down at Yang's hands. I let him suffer and put her in danger. I don't think Petaley blames you for anything that happened, Blake offered, feeling a small sickness in her stomach. If she's gonna be mad at any of us, then it'll be M-dash. Okay, can you both just stop it? Yang scowled in her direction. Neither of you did anything wrong, and if Petaley thought you did, then she wouldn't want you there. So can you stop with the mopiness? Today's gonna suck enough as it is. Sword dash. She was cut off again as the bathroom door opened and Weiss stepped out wearing a knee-length dress colored somewhere between a light blue and green. Why are you raising your voice? Because they're being silly. Yang sighed and looked the woman up and down. Why were you wearing bright colors? You're aware we're going to a funeral, right? I am, the heiress replied in an offended tone. Verdigris is a mourning color in Atlas. Oh, Yang backtracked. I didn't know that. Sorry. Weiss squinted at the girl, but seemingly thought better of starting an argument, and instead moved over to her bed to brush her hair. We should be going in a few minutes. We still have an hour, Blake replied and fixed her jacket. And we need to catch an airship and drive through midday traffic. I would rather not risk being late. No point arguing, Blake. Yang sighed. You know what she's like with her punctuality. Letting out a sigh, Blake laid back on her bed. She wasn't exactly looking forward to the funeral herself. Though she knew it had saved the girl's life, she still hated what she had done that day, but more so what she had been prepared to do. So, much like Ruby, she too shared that same innate fear of facing the grieving girl. How would she react? Would she be scared of her? Would she resent her? She didn't know, but that feeling persisted. So much so that she was still unable to pick up her weapon without checking the grip for remnants of her actions. "All right, Rubes," Yang said as she finished tying off the lace. "All done." Glancing up from her bed, Blake looked over and surveyed her girlfriend. It was weird to see her without an ounce of red on her body. Almost every single part of her clothing was pure black, and even the red cloak that had been present every day she had known her was missing. The only hint of color that remained was the red tips of her hair, the usually windswept locks having been smoothed out to frame her face. "You look great," she offered as the leader inspected herself in the mirror. "Thanks." "All right," Weiss grumbled and stood up. "Are we all ready to go?" A murmuring of agreement ran throughout the room, and Weiss gave a satisfied nod before making her way to the door. Pushing herself off the bed, Blake moved to join her, only to feel a strong hand catch her shoulder. "Wait." She turned to see Yang glancing just above her head. "Where's your bow?" "Oh." Blake felt one of her ears fold and gave a small shrug. "Well, it's rude to cover your trait at a funeral, so I decided not to wear it." Feeling her teammates' eyes on her as they registered what she'd just said, Blake rubbed the top of her arm anxiously. She would be lying if she said she wasn't nervous about leaving the room uncovered and displaying her ears to her fellow students, especially with how they had treated her over the last week. However, she wasn't even sure what the point of wearing her bow even was anymore. Everyone already knew she was a faunus, and the original reason for opting to wear it felt foolish in hindsight. In fact, she was beginning to agree with Weiss more and more over the last few days. Wearing it just felt stupid, and no longer served any purpose except to irritate her ears. "Well, I think you look better like this," Ruby said, her hand slipping into hers and a warm smile beaming up at her. "Same," Weiss echoed from behind her. "Now can we go?" "All right, relax," Yang sighed. "We're coming." With a relieved breath, Weiss left the room and Ruby took off after her. However, before Blake could follow, she felt the hand on her shoulder tighten and pull her into the blonde's arms. Just like always, the warmth that exuded from her partner was comforting enough to rival her mother's. "I'm proud of you," the woman uttered into her ear. It was a small gesture, but Blake still felt a lump form in her throat. Raising her arms, she wrapped them around her best friend and allowed herself to enjoy the moment. It didn't last long though, and the two soon parted to give each other a grateful look. Just like with Ruby and Weiss, Blake really didn't know where she would be without the blonde's unwavering support. "Took you long enough, th. Yawn!" "All right," Yang bellowed back and shook her head. "Holy elm! Remind me to set her stupid clock back the next time any big event comes up." Feeling a wet chuckle leave her throat, Blake reached up and wiped her eyes. "I'll help you do it. And we can blame it on Ruby when she finds out." Yang grinned, slipping her arm around her shoulder and steering them towards the door. "Now come on. Let's go show the world those adorable ears of yours." The small chapel was busier than Ruby expected. With it having been nearly 2 weeks since the mission had ended, she had forgotten just how large the group traveling with her had been, but there she was sat in a room filled with almost 40 people. Of course, Callie and Gyra were there, roaming around the room and greeting everyone as they entered, but to Ruby's surprise, so were the guards. Or at least the guards that had made it to Vale. Scattered among them, though, were the few families that had been traveling with them. Mr. Fern and his daughter were sitting on one of the pews, the look of misery on their face unsurprising as Gyra had informed her that they had memorialized Mrs. Fern the day before. With no body to bury, the woman's name had instead been added to the ever-growing wall of the lost that stood in the center of Vale. Dottie and her grandson sat across from them, seemingly offering words of support. A few other families that she hadn't really interacted with during the mission also sat nearby too, and even the Slates, a young married couple who had not been particularly fond of the man, had arrived to pay their respects. The only person who wasn't there, however, was Petaley. The girl had yet to leave the back room of the chapel, not that Ruby blamed her, but with only 20 minutes until the service began, she knew the girl would be out any moment. "No matter how many funerals I go to, they never stop being uncomfortable," Blake sighed, plunking down in the seat beside her. "Same," Ruby grumbled. Within she had her cloak to wrap herself in. "How are your parents?" "Busy." The faunus let out a small yawn, and a pang of guilt ran through her for once again waking her up in the middle of the night. "I'll catch up with them later." Ruby merely gave a small nod in return and remained silent. Talking felt uncomfortable, like a small ball was lodging itself in her throat and expanding with every word. Thankfully, Blake didn't seem to be in the mood for conversation either, so taking her hand, Ruby simply rested her head against her girlfriend's shoulder and let the silence calm her nerves. It didn't last long though, as a few minutes later Petaley finally emerged from the back room wearing a dark green dress, and Ruby stifled a small groan. The girl looked so much worse than the last time she had seen her. The usually pale skin was starting to turn gray, only making her bright red hair stand out even more, along with the innumerable red scars that covered her face. Beside her was a man with pale brown hair that Ruby didn't know, but his smile was warm as he placed a hand on the top of the girl's head and ruffled her hair. As the grieving girl's tired eyes glanced around the room, their eyes caught, and Ruby felt a wave of nerves pulse through her. Nevertheless, she raised a hand to greet her. "Here she comes!" Blake mumbled as the girl began to weave her way through the crowd, only giving those who greeted her a polite nod in return. "She doesn't look good. I doubt I look better after my mom died," Ruby muttered sympathetically. Lifting her head off of Blake's shoulder, Ruby stood to her feet and straightened out her dress. Once again, the feeling of having something lodged in her throat returned, but she swallowed to force it down as the girl grew close enough for Ruby to see her freckles. Sadly, the closer she came, the worse the scars that littered her face appeared to be. Though some were thin enough to easily be ignored, more than a few of the cuts had been deep enough to leave angry, red lines along her skin. "Hey!" She gave the young girl a meek smile. "Hi!" Petaley replied in an uncharacteristically dull voice. A moment of silence passed between them, as the smaller redhead's arms folded around herself. "You, the man said in a soothing tone and put a hand on her shoulder. "You want to introduce me, Tilly?" The girl stayed quiet again, looking down at her shoes. The man didn't seem to mind though, and he gave her an understanding nod before turning to them both. "Park Hamill," he said, and held his free hand out. "Blake." "Ruby." She took the hand and shook it. "Ah, now those are familiar names." Despite the calm smile on his face, Ruby still felt a little nervous, and couldn't help but wonder what Petaley had been saying about them. "You're Prince's ex, right?" Ruby replied, his name also being familiar. "He mentioned you a few times." He scratched the back of his head. "Something like that. Though I suppose it would be more accurate to say we were just on a break." His face fell a little and sadness entered his eyes. "Though I also suppose that doesn't really matter now, I guess. Sorry." "I'm sorry for your loss," Blake offered. The man gave a weak smile in return. "Thanks." Taking a deep breath, Park Hamill shook his head. "Anyway, I believe Tilly has something to say to you. Right, Tilly?" Glancing down at the girl, Ruby saw her idly picking at the sleeve of her dress. Almost instinctively, a part of her wanted to reach out and give her a hug just as Yang did whenever she was feeling down, but she figured that would likely be overstepping a boundary. So instead, she merely stood there and waited for the girl to feel comfortable. It took a few minutes, but eventually she took a shuddering breath. She raised a hand to wipe away a tear that was forming in her eyes. As she did, the sleeve fell back, and for the brief moment that her skin was visible, Ruby saw that her arm was also covered in scars. "I just wanted to thank you both." Petaley's voice sounded rough, each word coming out like nails on a chalkboard. "You tried to save P. Prince, and you saved me, and I appreciate it." "Oh." Ruby was taken aback. She had been sure that the girl would resent them for letting her brother suffer needlessly. However, standing before the girl and watching a small tear fall down her eyes, she could see that there wasn't actually a hint of resentment within her. Ever since returning to Vale, the idea that all she did that day was make things worse had remained a constant in the back of her head, but maybe she was wrong. She might not have been able to save anyone, but she had at least done something that somebody appreciated. She paused and let her shoulders drop. "I just wish I could have saved him." "But from what I hear, you tried." Park Hamill smiled. "And we're grateful for that. And I'm grateful that you kept Tilly here alive. That's all Prince would have asked you to do if he could have." "It's no problem," Ruby heard the fauness say, though a single glance in her eyes showed that Blake's mind was thinking through things just as much as hers. "I'm sorry about the throat, though." "It's fine." Petaley shrugged sullenly. I don't even know which scar it is." With only a few scars reaching down to her neck, it was obviously a lie to make Blake feel better, but it seemed to work. Though faint, an appreciative smile tugged at the fawn's lips, and she gave the redhead a slight tilt of her head. Taking the woman's hand, Ruby moved in closer to add a little more support, and to accept some herself. "All right," Parkhamill said, placing his hand on the girl's head and affectionately ruffling her hair. "Me and Tilly should be heading out. It's almost time for the committal." Ruby gave a small nod of her head. "Good luck. And thank you for inviting us. Prince seemed like a really good guy." "He is." Petally's raw voice trailed off as she clearly caught her error, but before she could correct it, the tears that had been swimming in her eyes finally overflowed. With a soft look at the girl, Parkhamill knelt down before the girl and pulled a slip of paper from his pocket, upon which was drawn a bright orange cloak. A quick flick of his wrist, the paper faded away, and a familiar cloak sprawled out into his hands. Wrapping it around the crying girl's shoulders, he reached up and used his thumb to wipe a tear away. "Is this correct?" the man said in a soft voice. "Though he's no longer here on Remnant, and you might not be able to see him, he will always be with you. Death is never the end, merely the chance to watch over the ones we love for eternity. Never forget that." Ruby recognized the words. Her dad had said them to her and Yang so many years ago, as they stood side by side at their mom's grave, and though she wasn't particularly religious herself, she'd always clung tightly to the hope that her mom was still looking over her. And apparently the words resonated with Petally too, as with a small sniffle to herself, the girl let herself be pulled into a hug and wrapped her arms around the man. The hug didn't last long though, and before long the two parted and gave them a small wave before heading towards the door. As they disappeared around the corner, Ruby let out a sad sigh and slumped back into her chair, quickly followed by Blake, who let out a small groan. "I suppose Yang was right," the faunus mumbled. Ruby glanced over at her sister, who was standing with Weiss talking to a pair of guards. "She usually is," she admitted. "It does get infuriating," Blake hummed. A short silence followed, during which Ruby leaned her head back against her girlfriend's shoulder. "Is it stupid that I almost wish Petally was mad at me for what I did?" Ruby shook her head, feeling the exact same way. "Maybe, but I get it. It would be simpler, I guess." She looked up at her girlfriend. "Would you change what you did if you could?" Blake stayed quiet for a moment, but eventually shook her head. "I don't like it, but it saved her life. Angry, grateful. She couldn't be either if she wasn't alive. What about you?" Despite all the thinking she had been doing, Ruby still didn't know. Unlike Blake, her actions did have consequences. While she had done what she did to give someone the best possible chance at life, her actions had doomed even more. No matter what action she had taken, someone would have died. "I don't know," she grumbled. "This time? No. But I know that needs to change." "It does." The woman's tone was understanding. "Just don't feel like you have to change too much. Learning to accept that you can't save everyone is good, but forgetting who you are because of it would not. We all kind of want to keep that hopeful girl who's always encouraging us to see the best in the world." "Don't worry." Ruby smiled and nestled her head deeper into Blake's shoulder. "She's not going anywhere." "Goo dash." "All right, everyone." A loud voice interrupted her, and they both turned to look at the priest. "The service and burial is about to begin. If you would please follow me." Exhaling a small breath as the sound of shuffling filled the room, Ruby stood to her feet and wrapped an arm around her girlfriend's. Remembering that the final goodbyes of her mom's funeral had without a doubt the worst part of the whole thing, a renewed sense of melancholy fell upon her. "Here we go," she muttered. The service itself had been a rather nice one with many stories exchanged, even a few that caused chuckles to ring through the crowd. However, once the body had been buried and Petally had left to go home with Parkhamill, the crowd had been quick to disperse and return to their day. All except Blake, who had wandered through the halls of the chapel in search of her parents, while her team went to buy some drinks from a nearby store. "Mom?" she called, not even sure her parents were even still in the building. "In here, dear." Following her mother's voice around the corner, Blake finally found her parents standing before the altar with the priest. Much to her surprise, she saw the older man muttering a prayer while swinging an incense burner over their clasped hands, the two fondest wedding cloth wrapped around its metal frame. "Sorry," she muttered, stepping in the doorway and crossing her arms. "I didn't know you WR dash." "Nonsense, dear," her mother said, reaching out to beckon her over. Obeying, she walked over and let her mom link their arms. "Your father and I have gone too many blessings without you by our side as it is. We would have invited you to this one, but we thought you were heading out with your team," her dad said with a happy smile. "Weiss and Yang went to get drinks, and Ruby wanted to be alone for a bit." "Understandable," Callie nodded. "Funerals are not the nicest of occasions." "MMM," she hummed, the strong smell of incense already flooding her nose and making her feel a little lightheaded. "Well, I'm glad something nice is happening today." "As am I," said the aged priest in a shaky voice, his free hand reaching out to stop the burner. "You may retrieve your bands." "Thank you, Reverend." Gyra reached out and took the purple and black bands back, quickly tying his wife's back to her arm. With a nod to them all, the elder man trotted away, and Blake felt her mom begin to pull her towards the door. Looking across at the older woman's face, she saw a sly grin pulling at her lips and let out a groan. "It's only been 3 months, Mom." I know," the woman said, entirely unconvincingly. "But I'm your mother. I'm allowed to imagine, am I not?" "We both know that even if she says no, you will anyway," Gyra chuckled. Despite the day, a smile curled on Blake's lips. "So long as it stays in your head, I suppose. Besides, we haven't even said I love you yet. But it's clear you both feel it." "It is?" "Tell her, Gur." "You two did remind me of your mother and myself in our youth," the man hummed fondly. "Miss Rose clearly cares deeply for you." "Oh." Feeling her cheek warm a little, Blake lowered her head a little and avoided her parents' gaze. In truth, the words had already almost slipped out on more than one occasion. However, she'd stopped herself at the last minute. Not because she wanted to be sure herself, because after weeks of thought she already knew where she landed on that, but because it just hadn't felt like the right time. With everything going on in Ruby's life and everything she was having to figure out, it just hadn't felt right to potentially add more confusion on top if she wasn't quite there yet. "I know. Just haven't really had the time to talk about us in a while, you know. And she hasn't really been in the mood lately." "Oh, you're just like your father." Her mom chuckled and hugged her arm even closer. "Both of you worry too much. When we were dating, he spent weeks trying to find the best time to say those words." "And how did you do it?" "It was perfect," the man replied fondly. "A nice evergreen and tuna picnic on the Kowloon Bay. I still remember the way your mother's eyes gleamed in the setting Sunday." The older woman cast the man an adoring gaze and pulled her even closer as a smile appeared on her face. "Isn't he charming?" she said, her voice almost youthful again. "But as perfect as that was, he could have told me the same thing while we cleaned the floor, and I would have loved it just as much." The two shared an affectionate glance, and Callie reached out to link her other arm with his. "Had my younger self known that, he could have saved himself so much time, though could and would are two very different things." He pulled his wife's hand to his lips and pressed a kiss against it, causing the woman to let out a small giggle. "Have you maybe thought about bringing Miss Rose to the spring festival? Your spring break is coming up, and it would be nice to have you home for a few days." The idea definitely sounded nice. Just the thought of going home again was enough to reignite the little bit of homesickness she had begun to feel over the last few days, and she did remember the spring festival quite fondly. However, as much as she would have loved to accept that offer, she couldn't. "I'd love to," Blake said with an apologetic grimace. "But I already have plans for the spring break. But I promised to be home for summer." "Summer works perfectly for us." Her mom smiled happily. "We are just happy that you will be returning at some point. The library has come along amazingly recently." "I can't wait to see it," she replied, reaching out to push the door open. "And to go home again." "We cannot wait either," Callie hummed constantly. "Now, let us go and find that wandering Rose of yours. With so much going on, we haven't had the time to meet her properly." "Mum. I will be good. Mostly." With a roll of her eyes and a shake of her head, Blake let out a soft chuckle and relented. "Okay, fine. There's a bakery this way, so that's our best bet. Lead the way." More than happy to do so, Blake let herself fall into a comfortable stride beside her parents as a smile tugged at her lips. Despite all the horrible things that had come out of the mission, she was very happy that it had at least allowed her to fix things with her parents. So, as her mother began to talk a little more about the new library and menagerie, Blake listened intently and steered them around the corner towards the bakery in search of her girlfriend. "You doing okay, Rubes?" "Yeah. Just been a long day." Letting out a yawn, Ruby dropped onto the bar stool while her sister ordered some drinks from a familiar-looking, raven-haired girl in a white dress. Under normal circumstances, Ruby would have preferred not to be spending her time in a nightclub, especially one that she was certain was owned by a criminal. However, not much choice had been given. Thankfully, the place wasn't technically open, but Yang's connection to the staff meant they had been allowed in to have a quiet drink by themselves. "Tell me about it," the blonde groaned, sitting down as the bartender walked. "Today brought back a few too many memories for my liking." "Same." She pulled a cookie that Callie had bought her earlier from her pocket and slowly nibbled at it. "Watch the coffin go down. It felt like Mom's all over again." It had definitely been a difficult sight to watch. So much so that she had needed a few minutes to herself afterwards to decompress. Her solitude had not lasted long though, as less than 30 minutes into it Blake had appeared with her parents. Fortunately, while she still didn't entirely agree with it, reading Blake's diary had helped her see a little more of what Weiss had meant about the two potentially making things worse had they tried to take Blake home, and she found it to be much easier to relax around them both. "Do you think funerals ever get easier?" "Not really." Ruby felt Yang's arm pull her into a warm, sidelong hug. "Pretty sure there's something that always sucks, no matter what." "Thought so." She sighed, as the girl returned and placed 4 drinks on the table. "Thanks, Mel's." Yang smiled at the girl. "Sure," the Ravenet said in a bored, droning tone, and glanced over to an identical girl in a red dress over in the corner of the room. "Word of advice, stay away from Miltia. She's in a super bitchy mood today, and she's still mad at you." "Isn't she always?" Yang remarked. "Thanks for the heads up though." Without another word, the girl flicked her hair over her shoulder and walked away. Looking across at her sister, she saw a relieved look on Yang's face. It was confusing, especially since the woman had just found out that her friend's sister didn't like her. "Why doesn't her sister like you?" she asked and picked up 2 of the drinks. The blonde scratched her head. "I was stupid a little while ago, but Miltia doesn't hate me. Anger means she cares. It's when she ignores you that you know you've fucked things up." "Oh, so like Weiss?" "Pretty much, yeah." Yang chuckled and grabbed the 2 remaining drinks. Pushing away from the bar, the 2 of them walked back over to the table where Blake and Weiss were having a casual conversation. Sitting down beside her girlfriend, Ruby placed the woman's drink down and took a sip of her own strawberry lemonade. "So how long till she talks to you again?" Blake asked as they sat down, happily accepting the black drink and taking her hand in the process. "I dunno. She's kinda sensitive about Mel's due to their semblances." Yang sighed. "What's their semblances?" Ruby asked curiously. "I dunno, but it only works on each other. Miltia can feel Melanie's feelings, and Melanie knows all of Milsh's thoughts." "Really? Didn't the twins' mom thought have joined semblances too?" "It's rather common, actually," Weiss interrupted, sipping her white and pink drink. "Especially amongst identical twins. A business associate of my father has a pair of boys who can swap places with each other no matter where they are." "Huh." That was something Ruby hadn't known, but something definitely worth noting for the future. "Anyway, enough about my troubles," Yang hummed. "What were you 2 talking about?" "The service," Blake replied. "It was different from what we're used to." "Nice, quiet, and basic." Yang nodded. "Just like Vale likes them." "Still sucks that she had to bury him in the first place," Ruby grimaced. "That's 2 funerals we've attended this year already." "Well, with the Grim getting more dangerous, I'm pretty sure that number is only going to continue increasing." Ruby knew her partner was right. Though she still believed that one day the people of Remnant would be in a position to defeat the Grim, that day was certainly not going to arrive for a while. Unfortunately, the Grim were definitely not waiting around for that day to come, and barely a day would pass where she wasn't reminded of the creature's growing numbers. But with recent events, That was something that only encouraged her to continue her training more, so that when she was ready, she could save as many people as she could. Especially if the more secure towns, like Secure, can barely hold off a horde, Yang added. It just means we have to make fewer mistakes, Ruby reasoned, all head turning to her. That I need to make fewer mistakes. I thought you said earlier that you wouldn't dash. I still wouldn't. Ruby cut off her girlfriend. But that wasn't the mistake I made. Ruby took a deep breath. While the service had not exactly been the most fun thing ever, it had been during that hour where the realization had come to her. It hadn't been the first time, however this time she knew it was true. And the 30 minutes she had spent thinking about it before Callie showed up had only convinced her more of that fact. The mistake I made was accepting the mission. The team was silent, and Ruby gave her girlfriend an apologetic look. We weren't ready, she explained further. I really wanted to help, to make sure you didn't have to worry about your parents, but there were other options. CFEY, ONYX, any of the fourth years. Anybody but us. But I let my emotions get the better of me, just like I did with the Helk, and insisted that we go, and Prince died because we weren't experienced enough. That was my fault. Her team were silent, and Ruby watched as they exchanged looks between themselves. Ruby, that's no dash. Ruby's right. Much to Ruby's surprise, it was Blake who cut Yang off. We shouldn't have gone. But, she turned back to face her. That wasn't just your fault. We all pushed for that, and I approved it. But you all followed my lead, Ruby retorted with a shake of her head. I'm the leader. I'm the one who should be keeping a level head, but I didn't. I need to work on that. You may be the leader, Ruby, but you have never run this team as a dictatorship, Weiss countered her. And neither should you. We've told you before, we respect you because you take our opinions into consideration, and we all decided to take on that mission. The fault is with all of us. A muttering of agreement ran across the table from Ruby's other two teammates, and she let out a small, resigned sigh. Though Weiss was right that she always took her team's feelings into consideration, it was still ultimately her who decided what action they took. However, knowing that none of them were going to budge, she decided it was best to not argue with them. All right, she breathed. Well, no matter whose fault it is, we can't make the same mistake again. The next time we take a mission, we have to be sure we are ready. So I'm guessing that means more training? Yang said, stretching her arms above her head. And more studying, Ruby confirmed. The chill showed us that even if we know how to fight, it means nothing if we don't know what we are fighting against. Can you sort out a schedule for that, Weiss? I can. And I can sort out a training program, Yang added, starting with finally getting you more comfortable with hand-to-hand. Ruby gave her sister a nod, knowing that was an area where she definitely needed help. If Blake wouldn't mind, I would actually like some dual-wielding training, Weiss questioned. If I can summon a second sword, there is no reason I shouldn't have it in my arsenal. I can do that, Blake smiled at the heiress. Sounds like we have a plan then. Yang smiled and leaned back in her seat. MHM, Ruby nodded. I know that sometimes we won't be able to save everyone, and I'm going to work on accepting that, but until then, we can at least work on being the best team we can be. I would really like to take back our top spot from JMPR. Me too, Yang agreed with Weiss. Before we start getting all of that sorted though, I recommend we take the night to relax. Today has sucked, and we need to unwind as a team. This time I agree with Yang. About damn time, the blonde cheered. So time to get this party started. Reaching out, the woman grabbed her drink and raised it. To becoming the best team ever. To become Dash. No, Ruby interrupted her partner, raising her own drink towards her sisters. To Prince. To Prince, the rest of the team said after a moment, their glasses clinking into hers. Blake still found it weird that she had become so accustomed to the loud, head-thumping music of the nightclub. Less than a year ago, the mere thought of being sat in such a place surrounded by people dancing with such fervor that the smell of sweat clung to the air would have been incredibly distressing. However, after having been dragged around town by her partner for the better part of the last year, that was no longer the case. Instead, she had grown to quite enjoy it. While it definitely wasn't relaxing by any means, it was undeniable that every time she was there she did end up having a good time. Unwinding with her friends, forgetting her worries, burning off some excess energy. Blake had long since accepted the merits to her partner's favorite pastime, and had therefore not been opposed when she had suggested staying at the club for the rest of the night. Much to her surprise, neither had the rest of the team. As such, the past few hours had passed in a whir of dancing and laughter. However, after having had more than enough of dancing for a while, Blake had retired to their cubicle to sit beside Weiss. While the heiress had not yet got up to join the throngs of people swarming the center stage, she too seemed to be enjoying herself as she watched Ruby and Yang enjoying themselves across the room. "It's good seeing her smile again," Blake commented over the loud music, watching as Ruby visibly laughed at something her sister had said. "MHM," Weiss hummed in agreement as she sipped her drink. "If there is one thing Yang excels at, it is taking people's mind off of things. It's not been a bad thing to have this past week. True, though she's been more angry than joyful this week. You haven't exactly been better." The woman gave a dismissive shrug. "If people are willing to badmouth my friend, then they should be ready for me to badmouth them. The difference is that I do it to their face." Blake couldn't deny that both of the women definitely had a good reason to be angry. As much as she was preaching peaceful actions to her friends, she wasn't exactly happy with her treatment at the hands of her fellow students either. However, as much as she appreciated their desire to help her, she knew that being aggressive was not going to fix things. "And I'd like you to stop." Weiss raised an eyebrow. "With the hostility, at least. Feel free to keep calling them out. That's something more people should be doing, but making them cry is a little too far. Also, we're friends, and I know that's not who you want to be." I suppose you are right." The white-haired woman nodded. "Though I make no promises. I tend not to have the patience to suffer fools. Just do your best." Blake smiled and took a sip of her martini. "That's all I ask." "MHM." Weiss returned the smile. "So what is it like not having your ears hidden?" "Scary." Blake laughed, her answer an honest one. "But I like it." It was true. As scary as it had been to leave the dorm room and have people openly gaze at her ears while whispering to each other, it had also felt rather liberating. No longer did she have to keep her ears perfectly still. No longer were words slightly muffled. No longer did she constantly feel like she was having to make sure her ribbon was in place. Instead, she felt free. Despite the comments and the looks, she was at the very least able to relax. "Well, we all feel the same." Weiss sipped her drink. "Hiding who you are will never do you any good. It will only internalize your problems." "I dunno, it was comforting for a while." Blake shrugged. "But I suppose you're right." "I usually am," the heiress replied with a smug grin. "Not very humble, though. I work hard to not need to be." Shaking her head, Blake laughed at her friend. Though she knew Weiss faced plenty of her own issues, the sheer amount of confidence the girl had in herself was something she'd always admired. "Is that a pity laugh, or did Weiss finally say something funny?" Yang asked as she slipped into the booth, Blake shuffling aside so that a sweaty Ruby could drop down beside her. "Uh-huh," the white-haired girl said sardonically. "Relax, Vanilla Bean. I'm kidding. Your puns are getting better." "Oh, I like that nom dash." "None of you are to call me Vanilla Bean." "Saving that one for Flint, huh? So when are you gonna tell him that you're accepting his date?" "Yang, leave Weiss alone," Ruby chuckled. "She'll ask Flint out when she's ready." "Actually," Weiss replied with a scowl, "I have already accepted." "Really?" Blake asked, unable to keep the surprise from her voice. "When?" "I called him after the service. There is a music festival on Saturday, so I told him that he is taking me." "Yes," Yang hooped. "Guess who just won a new pair of shades?" "You bet on me accepting?" "Please, it was hardly a bet. I knew you'd say yes. He presses all your buttons in the right way." Blake watched as Weiss fixed her friend with a small scowl. Or at least tried to. Clearly unfazed, the woman merely stuck out her tongue and downed the rest of her drink. "First my little sis and my best friend, then you and Flint." Yang grinned smugly. "You all doubted me, but you gotta accept that I'm a great matchmaker. For my next couple, I'm thinking Ilya and Melanie would work we dash." "Please no." Blake cut her friend off. "Ilya's had enough bad influences in her life." "Hey, that's my friend you're talking about." Blake raised an eyebrow. All right. You have a point. Thank you. Blake breathed a sigh of relief. Besides, when we go to Mistral, I intend to introduce her to Reese. I'm pretty sure they will get along very well. Mistral? Ruby questioned. Who's going to Mistral? Oh, Blake hesitated. I thought you might have. We're going to see Raven. Yang replied to her sister with a scratch of her head. You're still okay with that, right? Oh, I mean, so long as you're not going alone. The Reaper replied without hesitation. And you're careful. When am I not careful? I don't think you want her to answer that. Weiss jabbed and finished her drink. Wow, rude, Yang said in an insulted tone and pushed herself off the bench. For that one, you owe me a dance. Wah dash. Nope. This is a team outing, and you have been sitting here all night. Now, come on. Let's go and have some fun and leave the lovebirds to talk. Before Weiss could even try to argue, Yang's hand closed around her wrist and pulled her off of the bench. Despite her protests, however, the heiress dutifully followed the blonde, and the two quickly disappeared into the crowd. Left alone with her girlfriend, Blake flashed the redhead a smile. Want to grab some air? Yes. The Reaper breathed, sliding off of the seat and holding out her hand. More than happy to take the girl's hand, Blake let herself be pulled up from the bench. However, seeing no reason to let go of it after she was on her feet, she entwined their fingers and slowly led her girlfriend across the sticky dance floor and out of the main doors. As soon as they left the building altogether and the music faded away, she felt a soft breeze blow across her ears and let out a sigh of relief. That is so much better, she mumbled. It is a little too loud in there. I could barely think. I'm pretty sure that's why your sister likes it so much, Blake quipped. It wouldn't surprise me, Ruby chuckled. You seem to be enjoying yourself, though. She grinned as the girl hopped up onto a small wall and began to balance herself. Did Yang buy you alcohol? Only one drink. The leader smiled down at her. She stopped on the wall and spun around to face her. I'm just happy that things can still be like this. You know, fun. With a soft hum of agreement, Blake stepped a little closer to the girl and wrapped an arm around her waist. Looking up at her, she found herself captivated for a few moments at the way the girl's silver eyes reflected the moonlight, but quickly shook herself free of the thoughts that formed in her head. And I'm just happy to see you happy again, she admitted. I was a little worried about you for a bit. I'm fine. Ruby shook her head, her arms wrapping around the back of Blake's neck. I just needed some time to think things through. Blake gave an understanding nod. Thanks for being patient with me. No need to thank me. Ruby shook her head, her face turning a little more serious. There is. I know I've been keeping you awake, and that I haven't exactly been the most fun to be around, but you've still supported me. Even when you were going through your own stuff. You helped me stay hopeful. Well, I learned from the best. Blake teased, earning a soft smile in return. Seriously though, you really don't have to thank me. You've done the same for me on multiple occasions already. Besides... Blake paused as a strong pulse of anxiety rushed through her. She was still hesitant to finish that sentence. Not because she wasn't sure on how she felt, but because she wanted the moment to be right, and she definitely wasn't sure that hanging out in front of a nightclub was that. However, even as that thought entered her mind, as did her mom's voice telling her that she was worrying too much. And maybe she was right. Maybe there really wasn't a perfect time to say what she wanted. Maybe simply saying it was enough, regardless of what they were doing or where they were. After all, Ruby had never really cared for the grand displays of affection, always more than happy to merely spend a night watching movies with a takeaway than going out to a fancy restaurant. Besides what? Seeing the look of curiosity on her girlfriend's face, the way her eyes shined with inquisitiveness, Blake finally felt her hesitancy break. Her mom was right. It didn't matter. So, taking a deep breath to settle her nerves, Blake looked up at the Reaper, feeling her heart begin to race in her chest, and gave her a warm smile. I don't need to be thanked for helping the girl I love. The second the word left her mouth, Ruby's eyes widened. Frozen in place, Blake could see the thoughts rushing through her head, and with each passing second she felt her nerves grow and her head begin to spin with her own possibilities. Maybe she had said it too soon. Maybe Ruby wasn't ready to say it back yet. Which was fine, but where did they go from there? After what felt like an eternity though, the redhead finally replied. Why do you love me? That was her chance. If she really wanted to, she could take it back and avoid all the awkwardness. However, the very thought of doing such a thing felt wrong. Like she would be lying. Worse still, if Ruby did feel the same, then she would be hurting her feelings. And that certainly would not do. She swallowed her doubts. I do. She fiddled slightly with the back of Ruby's top. And it's fine if you aren't ready to say it yet. I don't mind, but you dash. I do too. You do? It was Blake's turn to be stunned. Butterflies exploded in her stomach, and a feeling of intense happiness descended upon her. Never in her life had she felt anything so strongly. It was like warmth was radiating out from her chest and spreading to every part of her body. And as Ruby's face broke into a wide, albeit shy, smile, and she gave a nod, that heat only grew more intense. So much so that she couldn't resist her urges anymore. Letting the happiness overwhelm her, she pushed herself up on her toes and pressed her lips against her girlfriend's. The instant they met, the world fell away, and a feeling of content bliss descended upon her. Even as they pulled away, the feeling remained. So, Ruby smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of her head. What do we do now? A nervous chuckle forced its way out of Blake's throat. I dunno. Maybe we can go for a walk? Yes. A walk does sound good. I like walking. The girl seemed to realize her awkwardness and deflated a little. That sounded stupid. Sorry. It's fine. Blake laughed. There is a late-night coffee shop nearby. We can go there and maybe, talk a bit. Talking so dash. Catching herself, Ruby let out a sigh and shook her head. I'd like that. Just let me go and tell Young. Sure. She smiled, stepping back as the girl leapt down from the wall and activated her semblance to boost back into the club. Waiting for the girl to return, Blake sat down on the wall and thought about what had just happened. After weeks of doubt and hesitation, of pain and nightmares, there was finally a ray of sunshine breaking through the clouds. Despite everything that had happened, she was happy. And from how flustered the girl had been, she knew that Ruby was too. And though there was undoubtedly still a lot of things to do, both in terms of their relationship and their future as huntresses, Blake knew that so long as they were at each other's side, all of that would without a doubt be so much easier. So as the girl re-emerged from the doors with their bags in hand, she stood up from the wall with a smile on her face and held out her hand. Ready to go? Yup. The girl beamed, taking it and leaning up to press a brief kiss against her lips. All right then. Blake grinned down at the girl and began to lead the way towards the store. Let's go! Chapter 69, Epilogue. All right. Ruby breathed as she stood up from the workbench. You ready? No, Weiss replied with a concerned voice. Raising her hand, the bracelet on her wrist glowed a light blue, and the air in front of her began to shimmer. Now I am. Smart. Yang chuckled, shuffling a little closer to the heiress. Hey! She gave them both a hurt look. This one is totally going to work. Whatever you say, Rubes. Scowling at her sister and partner, Ruby held out a rectangular device in front of her. It was the third phantom cage of its kind that she had created over the last 3 weeks. Sadly, the other two had not fared so well, so much so that she was still pretty certain that one of the rods she had used would be embedded in the walls of Beacon for as long as the school existed. Nevertheless, she had high hopes for the third, though not enough to activate the device without her aura. Letting it flow over her body, she took a small breath. Here we go, she muttered, pressing the button and feeling the device vibrate to life in her hand. She watched as the 4 corners of the rod split away from the center and thrust forward, the inside of each one lined with tiny hard-like dust crystals that projected a newly designed, superheated mesh cage. Thankfully, the ice crystals at the base of the rod seemed to be doing a good enough job of cooling the device, and Ruby felt a happy smile pull at her lips. So far the device was more successful than all the others. Still got my eyebrows. Yang chuckled. That's a good sign. Shush. Ruby scolded her, as Weiss elbowed the blonde in the side. Might as well try the retract function. Twisting the base of the rod, she watched as the rod slowly began to retract into the device, closing the space so that anything trapped within would be pushed towards the hidden spike at the top of the rod. Unfortunately, just as the rods made it halfway back to their original position, she felt the device begin to grind to a halt and knew something was about to go wrong. "Oh!" Just as the words left her lips, she saw the handle begin to freeze over and immediately realized that the ice crystals had frozen the gears inside as the rod slid back into place. Before she could even drop the device, it gave one last tremble before shattering in her hand, projecting a brief stream of heated hard light around the room. Ducking out of its way, she looked down to see her hand encased in a large ball of ice. "Crud!" Ruby swore disappointedly, dropping back into her seat and placing her frozen hand in the center of the table. "Don't worry, Rubles," Yang said, the previous teasing tone having been replaced with a supportive one. "You'll get it soon enough." "I know," she grumbled. "I just wanted this wand to work today. Would have felt like the universe was on my side." "Still nervous about the date, huh?" Yang grinned, bringing her fist down hard on the big ball of ice and causing a loud shattering sound to fill the room. "I still don't see why you were nervous," Weiss questioned, waving away the hard light barrier she'd summoned. "You have been dating for 4 months. You already started to take that step last month on the mission." "Wait!" "What?" Yang interjected, only to be ignored. "And it is obvious that you both want to go take it. Hell, Blake hasn't been able to keep her eyes off of you since you got that haircut, and I know you keep wearing that stupid wash lock on your lip to tease her. What is there to be nervous about?" Ruby ran a hand along the short hair on the left side of her head. With all the new training, she had quickly come to realize that having hair constantly swinging to cover her sniping eye was not the best decision ever. As such, she had quickly gone to Coco and had the girl give her a new hairstyle. She quite liked the new partial undercut the woman had given her. Not only did it keep the hair out of her sniping eye, but there was no denying that Blake was definitely fond of it too. Weiss was right though. For nearly a week, the tension between them had been growing. Pretty much any make-out session between them had begun to feel like it could easily lead to more, but it never had. Constant training and studying often left them too tired to actually take that step, and sharing a room with 2 other people certainly didn't make it any easier to find the time. However, with there being barely more than a week before spring break, when Yang and Blake would be leaving to find Raven, she knew the time had finally come for her to really make that push to make it happen. "I dunno," she shrugged, clearing the residual ice from her fingers. "It's my first time. What if I'm no good? Or I mess something up?" "Pretty sure Blake is aware of all that and doesn't care," Yang chuckled, standing up from her seat and stretching her arms. "But that is enough of hearing about my sister's sex life for me. I'm ahead to the library and see if Blake and Velvet are done with whatever it was they were doing." "Having fun," Weiss hummed. "Later," Ruby hummed. "Your stay dash." "With Coco and Velvet tonight, yes," Yang confirmed as she walked past, stopping to place a hand on her shoulder. "Just remember my advice, Rubles. Sex is supposed to be fun. Relax and enjoy yourself, and ask questions. Blake won't care if you're a little clumsy at first, all right?" Looking up at her sister, she saw the blonde giving her a supportive smile. "Thanks," she replied, grateful for the advice. "No problem. Dork," the brute chuckled, flicking her forehead before walking away with a satisfied chuckle. As the door opened, the loud sounds of drilling and tinkering flooded in from the main workshop, and Ruby stood up from the workbench. With her newest prototype scattered across the floor in a million little pieces, she knew there was no point spending the day making another without going over her plans. So, picking up her scroll, she pressed a few buttons on the nearby control panel to summon the cleaning bots, and let out a small yawn while motioning towards the exit. "Let me guess. Cookies?" Weiss asked with a raised eyebrow. "MHM," she nodded. "The best comfort food. Wanna come?" "Why not?" the woman shrugged. Exiting the workshop into the brightly lit campus, they slowly began to make their way towards the food court. "So did you finally figure out what you two are doing tonight?" Weiss asked curiously as they left the gates of the school. "Yup." Though she wasn't confident about the end of the night, Ruby was certain that Blake would at least love the start. "I booked a table at that new sushi place she wants to try, and after that the author of that book series she likes is doing a reading and answering questions." "Ninjas of Love?" Weiss said, giving her a weird look. "I seem to recall that you were interested in something from that too." With it being so rare for Weiss to tease her in such a way, it took Ruby a second to piece together what the woman meant. However, once she did, she felt her cheeks flush a little red. It had been months since the accidental Christmas gift, but the embarrassment remained nonetheless. No, she defended herself. Not that one. I meant the man with two souls. I forget that Blake does read good books occasionally. Weiss hummed. It certainly does sound like a night she will enjoy, though. Hopefully. Ruby smiled, happy that Weiss agreed with her. So what are you doing tonight? There is a dust exposition in town, and they've invited me as a guest. Well, I invited myself, and they were happy to have me, but me and Flint are attending, and will be returning tomorrow. That sounds fun. Ruby chuckled, happy that her partner's relationship was also going well. Guess we'll be going to a lot of those in Atlas? She said it as a joke, but Ruby was actually looking forward to spending her spring holiday in Weiss' home kingdom. Having never left Vale, it would certainly be an interesting experience, and with all the advanced technology and weapons the kingdom produced, there was no doubt she would be able to find something to take her mind off the danger Yang and Blake were traveling into. She was also looking forward to seeing Penny again. Atlas does love its dust. Weiss hummed noncommittally. Though I was hoping we would stay away from anything to do with my family. That's fine by me. Ruby smiled at her friend. Weapons expos it is. The woman gave a soft groan, but Ruby didn't mind. Having stumbled across a sealed document full of locations and events on the woman's tablet, Ruby knew Weiss was just as excited as she was. That was enough for her. So you're gonna be gone by the time we get back? She asked, just to make sure. The event starts at 4, so yes. Weiss confirmed. You will have the dorm to yourselves. Okay, good. Ruby breathed out a sigh of relief, glad that there would at least be no awkwardness when she and Blake returned from their date. Just. Weiss paused and gave her a serious look. Make sure you leave the window open. I would rather no dash. Please stop. Ruby groaned, not needing anything to make her more nervous than she already was. But I will, don't worry. Good. The heiress said, as the food court came into view. However, I would rather we not discuss such a thing while eating, so enough of that talk for now. That's fine by me, Ruby replied, wanting to take her mind off of her nerves anyway. So what are you having to eat? Steckerfish? Giggling as Weiss let out a disgusted noise, Ruby bumped the woman with her shoulder. She was happy that Weiss was always around to talk when she needed to. So, dodging a small glyph that was cast in front of her, she did her best to put her worries aside and simply enjoy a small lunch with her friend. As night began to fall over Vale, Ruby cast a glance up at her girlfriend. The night had been incredible. The first hour had been spent in the new sushi restaurant that Blake had been wanting to try. Though it wasn't Ruby's favorite food, it was fun watching Blake enjoy herself as she tasted as much of the menu as she could. During the meal, they had simply talked about anything and everything. Ruby's project, Blake's renewed interest in social history, how they were both feeling about the team's new schedule. It had been light and effortless, just as it always was. But the book reading had been better. Cuddled up together on a small love seat, the both of them had listened as the author read out her favorite section from her newest book. The overall feeling had been rather intimate, and Ruby had very much enjoyed finally getting to simply relax and enjoy her girlfriend's company again, something that had become rather rare over the past month. She had also loved seeing the girl come alive once the reading was done, engaging the author in numerous questions and discussions about the excerpt that had been read. It was rare that Ruby got to see that side, but she always loved it when she did. After it was all done, however, the two of them had returned to Beacon, stopping on the way to grab some dessert before idly wandering the campus of the school. So, Ruby hummed, taking a small bite of her strawberry daifuku. Did you enjoy the night? From the smile that spread across Blake's face and the light that was dancing behind her amber eyes, Ruby already knew the answer. Of course, the fauness replied, as if any other answer was unthinkable. But you do know we could have done things that you wanted to do as well, right? We did, she grinned. I wanted to do what you wanted to do. Hopping up onto the fountain ledge as she heard Blake chuckle, Ruby spun around to face her girlfriend and took a second to take her in. She looked great as always. Her amber eyes were alight and alive, more so than Ruby had ever seen them. Ever since fixing her relationship with her parents, the woman definitely seemed happier. Of course, She still had her off days, and Ruby was very aware of just how much Blake still doubted how she was going to make the changes she wanted, but the smiles that Ruby loved were more often seen across the woman's beautiful face. Her favorite part, however, was Blake's ears. Though they had been frequently pressed flat against her head for the first few weeks after removing the ribbon, the past week had seen them standing upright and proud. It was a delight to see, not only because Ruby found the ears to be one of many adorable parts of her girlfriend, but because seeing Blake become much more confident and at ease with who she was despite others' thoughts was something she believed everyone deserved. "I suppose I can't argue with that logic," Blake smiled, hopping up beside her. "Though our next date will definitely be Ruby-centric." She hummed, holding out the last of her sweet and placing it in Blake's mouth. "And what if I want to do what you want to do? Again? Then what I would want to do would be what you find interesting." "Damn. Beat by my own logic." Hearing the woman chuckle, Ruby moved in closer and wrapped a hand around the fawn's waist. With the slight spring chill beginning to move in, the little extra warmth felt good. "Well, I am the smart one in the relationship," Blake smirked playfully. "What?" Ruby scoffed. "I totally have the better grades." "Not in general studies. You also gave yourself stomach cramp last week." "That was Nora's fault. Still can't believe she ate more pancakes than I ate cookies." "I think that sentence only proves my point." "Oh, well, what?" Unable to think of a counterpoint, Ruby quickly searched for something to say. However, before a retort could be found, a mischievous idea began to form in her head. She needed to be sneaky about it, though. "Well," she grinned, "you're also the wet one." "Wah dash." Cutting the woman off by placing a quick kiss on her lips, Ruby hopped down from the wall and pushed her girlfriend backwards into the fountain. Before Blake could hit the surface, the fawness dissolved into shadow and her body was pushed upwards. With a graceful backflip, she landed on the head of the statue in the center with a smug look on her face. "Outsmarted again," Blake teased, striking a pose atop the giant metal huntsman. "Or was I?" Sticking out her tongue, she reached out with her foot to where she knew the control panel was and pressed a button to activate the water jets that would usually only be active during the day. Giant spouts of water erupted around the pool, and though normally they would all cross over each other above the huntsman's head, they were obstructed by the body of the young huntress, which was immediately soaked from head to toe. "Huh!" She cheered victoriously, her arms wide as her girlfriend attempted to block the water with her hands. "Who's the smart one now?" "Oh, is that how it is?" Blake called. Through the veil of water, Ruby watched as the raven-haired girl jumped from the top of the statue and once again turned into shadow. Sensing what was coming, she used her semblance to jump into the air and narrowly avoided the wave of water that had been sent her way. Unfortunately, just as she came to a halt midair, she saw the figure in the pool fade from existence as a wet body collided with hers and sent her crashing to the floor. Activating her aura to protect her from the damage, she landed on her back and quickly felt her wrists pinned against the pavement as Blake straddled her. Struggling against the grip, though putting up no real attempt at resistance, Ruby laughed as Blake dragged her soaking wet hair back and forth across her face. Streams of water flowed from the fawn's body, and Ruby felt her clothes quickly begin to cling to her skin. "Aw, dash. Who's the wet one now, huh?" the woman said in a mirthful voice. "Gaw, stop!" she laughed in response. I'm sorry. MHM. Blake hummed, stopped her movements. "And who's the smart one again?" Ruby teased. "Well, you're wetter than me, so I'll say I am." "Oh, really?" Blake said, a mischievous tone entering her voice. "Well, let's see if we can fix that." Though Ruby expected the huntress to start attempting to soak her with her hair again, she was slightly surprised when Blake's face lowered and captured her lips with her own. As soon as their lips touched, the realization of Blake's innuendo hit her, and she felt her face heat up, but the fluttering that erupted in her stomach felt too good to even think about breaking the kiss. Instead, she happily returned the pressure and gave the woman a soft hum. For what felt like minutes, they simply laid there and enjoyed the make-out session. At some point, Ruby's hand had been released and found its way to Blake's waist, neatly pulling it closer into hers, while Blake's cupped the side of her face. Just like always, it felt incredible, and Ruby's body was already beginning to respond. However, Despite the urge to succumb to it entirely, she got a hold of herself and gently pushed the woman away. "Sorry," the fauness mumbled, sitting up on her knees. "Got a little carried away there." D.B. Ruby replied and sat up with her, feeling her nerves begin to return. We should probably return to the room first." "Oh." Blake seemed stunned at first, but it quickly faded. "You want to? Tonight?" Biting her bottom lip, she pressed a brief kiss on her girlfriend's lips. Pulling back, she looked into her amazing amber eyes and gave a small nod. "If you want to, that is." Another kiss was shared, and Ruby felt Blake's hand seek her own. "You have no idea." The woman's eyes glinted excitedly. Watching Blake stand to her feet, she happily followed, and the two of them took off towards the dorm. From the fountain to their room, it was less than 10 minutes, but to Ruby it felt like an hour. Just as it had been for the past 2 days, a certain level of nervousness was coursing through her, but with the moment finally upon her, it was joined by something else. Something that she could only vaguely describe as hunger. Each glance at her girlfriend as they walked towards the dorm room made her want to stop and kiss her, but she knew she couldn't. If she did, then it would be almost impossible to stop. However, if she looked away, then it felt like hooks had dug themselves into her face and were attempting to drag her eyes back to the woman. It was a very new experience, and as such the entire walk had been spent stealing just long enough glances at the girl so that she could look away and focus on the path ahead. Fortunately for Ruby, they arrived at the dorm quick enough, and before the door was even fully shut, she felt Blake round on her and push her back against it. Many kisses had been shared up to that point, and many had led to heated moments. None, however, could compare to the one they shared in that moment. Blake's lips met hers with such fire that not even the wind-chilled water that clung to their clothes could cool it, and Ruby happily responded in kind. "MMM," she gasped as Blake's hands began to work the buttons of her shirt. "Blah, Blake." She placed her hand on her girlfriend's, and the girl's actions immediately slowed as she backed off. Not wanting her to get the wrong impression, Ruby helped her undo another button and looked into her eyes. There was hunger there too, and a level of excitement that caused Ruby's stomach to turn, but there was also love and caution. "Don't stop," she whispered. Blake raised her eyebrow, and she swallowed her nerves. "It's my first time, and I might not be any good. So just a dash." "Ruby." Blake's voice was soft, and the hand not on her shirt came up to rest against her cheek. "I promise you, nothing you do tonight will disappoint me." She saw the amber eyes fix her with a firm gaze. "You're sure?" 100%. Goo dash. Besides, a sultry tone entered the fauness' voice, and a smirk pulled at her lips. "I'm not gonna complain about getting to teach you." Feeling her heart skip a beat and heat begin to flood her body, Ruby gave Blake a nod. With the assurance that her doubts were just as baseless as she'd been told, she helped Blake remove the final button and reignited the kiss. Letting go of Blake's hand, she let her own run along the woman's chest and grabbed at the sides of her jacket, eagerly removing it and looking forward to what the night had in store for her. Ruby's body had never felt so weird before. Every single part of her was buzzing as if she'd just experienced the most incredible sugar rush of her life. The telltale feeling of excitement and hyperactivity coursed through her veins, but at the same time, she was tired, and not that moving her limbs felt like a mountainous task. Thankfully, there wasn't much reason to want to move. The bedding felt fluffy, like a cloud or the softest animal fur, and with every breath she could feel each fiber grazing against her sensitive skin. Even better though were Blake's fingers, the divine digits lazily drifting along the small of her back as they cuddled. With each stroke and scratch, a new surge of tingles ran through her and caused her fingers and toes to clench as the memory of what had led her to feel such a way pushed itself back into the forefront of her mind. Needless to say, the past 2 hours had been incredible. Blake had been incredible. Not only had she delivered onto her more pleasure than she'd ever known before, but she'd also been patient and guided her when needed, which had been often. Thankfully though, if her reactions were anything to go by, the fauness also seemed to have enjoyed herself too by the end. "MMM," she hummed contentedly as Blake's fingers delicately traced her spine. "That feels nice." Ruby felt a soft chuckle vibrate through the woman's chest where her head was laid. "So does what you're doing." Slightly confused at first, her head still slightly foggy from the pleasure that had previously racked it, she quickly realized that her own fingers were idly gliding along her girlfriend's ribs. However, since Blake was enjoying it, she felt no need to stop. For a little while, they simply laid there in silence, both enjoying the pleasant sensations and the afterglow of what had just happened. Much like it had been during the book reading, it was comfortable, and Ruby felt a calm descend over the room. "So," she breathed after a few minutes. How was it? I mean, how was I, you know?" Once again, she felt the small chuckle vibrate through her girlfriend, but it was quickly lost as Blake shifted her position lower into the bed. As they came face to face, Ruby saw a bright grin on the Fauna's face. "You were great," Blake reassured her. "Nothing to complain about on my end." Good, good." Ruby let out a sigh of relief, a small hint of pride blooming in her chest. "Nothing to complain about for me either. Tonight it was perfect." I'm inclined to agree." It was Ruby's turn to smile. Given all the stories she'd heard about dating, she couldn't believe just how lucky she'd been with her first girlfriend. Though it had never been a priority for her, dating had always been a concern. Finding someone to spend her time with, while also dedicating herself to her training, was something she was sure was going to be incredibly difficult. But somehow, the perfect person for her had not only been placed on her team, but returned her feelings. And Ruby knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Blake was indeed the perfect woman for her. "I'm lucky I have you," she grinned. "I'm pretty sure that's my line." Chuckling slightly, Ruby leaned forward and pressed a tender kiss against the woman's lips. "I love you." Saying it still gave her the same warm feeling as it had the first time. And just as she had the first time when Blake had said it, she saw the amber eyes light up with happiness. Feeling a hand land on her waist and pull her close, Ruby happily let it and snuggled in next to her girlfriend. "I love you too." Knowing that the warmth spreading through her body was only partially due to the skin contact, Ruby let out a blissful breath and returned to the hug. As silence once again fell upon them, she closed her eyes and simply allowed herself to enjoy the special moment. A moment that she knew was only special because she was sharing it with the woman she loved.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.